guys, so now I'm going to be reading chapter 2 and chapter 3 because they're both quite short chapters. Also, there's a poem in here, so I think you'll be excited about that. Chapter 2. After James Henry Trotter had been living with his aunts for 3 whole years, there came a morning when something rather peculiar happened to him. And this thing, which I say was the only rather peculiar, soon caused a second thing to happen, which was very peculiar. And then there was a very peculiar thing, in its own turn, caused a really fantastically peculiar thing to occur. It all started on a blazing hot day in the middle of summer. Aunt Sponge, Aunt Spiker and James were out in the garden. James had been put to work as usual. This time he was chopping wood for the kitchen stove. Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker were sitting comfortably in deck chairs nearby, sipping tall glasses of fizzy lemonade, watching him to see that he didn't stop work for one moment. Aunt Sponge was enormously fat and very short. She had small piggy ears and a sunken mouth, and one of those white flabby faces that looked exactly as though it had been boiled. She was like a great white soggy overboiled cabbage. Aunt Spike, on the other hand, was lean and tall and bony, and she wore steel-rimmed spectacles that fixed onto the end of her nose with a clip. She had a screeching voice, a long, wet, narrow lips, and whenever she got angry or excited, little flecks of spit would come out shooting of her mouth as she talked. And there sat these 2 nasty hags, sipping their drinks, and every now and again screaming at James to chop faster and faster. They also talked about themselves, each other, saying how beautiful she thought she was. Aunt Sponge had a long-handled mirror on her lap, and she kept picking it up, gazing at her own hideous face. "I look and smell," Aunt Sponge declared, "as lovely as a rose. Just feast your eyes upon my face, observe my shapely nose, behold my heavenly thick locks, and if I take you both my socks, you'll see my dainty toes. But don't forget," Aunt Spiker cried, "how much your tummy shows." Aunt Sponge went red. Aunt Sponge said, "My sweet, you cannot win. Behold my gorgeous curvy shape, my teeth, my charming grin. Oh, beautiful, oh, beauteous me, how I adore my radiant looks, and please ignore the pimple on my chin." "My dear old trout," Aunt Sponge cried out, "you're only bones and skin. Such loveliness as I poses cannot truly shine in Hollywood," Aunt Sponge declared. "Oh, wouldn't that be fine? I'd captured all the nation's hearts. They give me all the leading parts. The stars was all Rosine. I think you make," Aunt Spiker said, "a lovely Frankenstein." Poor James was sitting there slaving away. Poor James was still slaving away at the chopping block. His heart was terrible. He was sweating all over. His arm was aching. The chopper was large blunts, far too heavy for a small boy to use. And as he worked, James began thinking about all the other children in the world, and what they might be doing at this moment. Some would be riding tricycles in the gardens. Some would be walking in the cool woods and picking bunches of wild flowers. And all the little friends whom he used to know would be down by the seaside, playing in the wet sand and splashing around in the water. Great tears began oozing out of James's eyes and rolling down his cheeks. He stopped working and leaned against the chopping block, overwhelmed by his own happiness. "What's the matter with you?" Aunt Spiker screeched, glaring at him over the top of her steel spectacles. James began to cry. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work. you nasty little beast," Aunt Sponge ordered. "Oh, Aunt Sponge," James cried out, "and Aunt Spiker, couldn't we all, please, just for once, go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far, and I feel so hot and awful and lonely." "Why, you lazy, good-for-nothing brute," Aunt Spiker shouted. "Beat him!" cried Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will," Aunt Spiker snapped. She glared at James, and James looked back at her with large, frightened eyes. "I shall beat you later on the day when I don't feel so hot," she said. "And now get out of my sight, you disgusting little worm, and give me some peace." James turned and ran. He ran off as fast as he could to the far end of the garden and hid himself behind the damp clump of dirty old laurel bushes that we mentioned earlier on, and then he covered his face with his hands and began to cry and cry and cry. Chapter 3. It was at this point that the first thing of all, the rather peculiar thing that led so many other much more peculiar things happened to him. For suddenly, just behind him, James heard a rustling of leaves, and he turned around and saw an old man in a funky dark green suit emerging from the bushes. He was a very small old man, but he had a huge bald head and a face that was covered all over with the bristly black whiskers. He stopped when he was about 3 yards away, and he stood there leaning on his stick and staring hard at James. When he spoke, his voice was very low and creaky. "Come closer to me, little boy," he said, beckoning to James with a finger. "Come right up close to me and I will show you something wonderful." James was too frightened to move. The old man hobbled a step or two nearer, and then he put a hand into his pocket of his jacket and took out a small white paper bag. "You see this?" he whispered, waving the bag gently to and fro in front of James's face. "You know what this is, my dear. You know what's inside this little bag." Then he came nearer, still leaning forward and pushing his face so close to James, and James could feel the breeze blowing on his cheeks. The breath smelt musty and stale and slightly mould-wet, like air in an old cellar. "Take a look, my dear," he said, opening the bag and tilting it towards James. Inside it, James could see a mass of tiny green things that looked like little stones or crystals, each one about the size of a grain of rice. They were extraordinarily beautiful, and there was a strange brightness above them, a sort of luminous quality that made them glow and sparkle in the most wonderful way. "Listen to them move," the old man whispered. "Listen to them move." James stared into the bag, and sure enough, there was a faint rustling sound coming from inside it. And then he noticed that the thousands of little green things were slowly, very, very slowly, stirring about, moving over each other as though they were alive. "There's more power and magic in those things in there than in all the rest of the world put together," the old man said softly. But, what are they?" James moaned, finding his voice at last. "Where do they come from?" "Aha!" the old man whispered. "You never guessed that." He was crouching a little down now and pushing his face still closer and closer to James's until the tip of his long nose was actually touching the skin on James's forehead. Then suddenly he jumped back and began waving his stick madly in the air. "Crocodile tongues!" he cried. 1,000 long, slimy crocodile tongues boiled up in the skull of a dead witch for 20 days and nights with the eyeballs of a lizard. Add the fingers of a young monkey and the gizzard of a pig, the beak of a green parrot, the juice of a porch pine, and 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Stew for another week, and then let Lemon to do the rest. All at once, he pushed the white paper bag into James's hands and said, "Here, you take it. It's yours." Okay, guys, that's the end of the 2 chapters. I hope you enjoyed it. Be back for chapter 4 and possibly 5 as well. I think I'm going to do 4 and 5 because they're really short chapters. So yeah, hope you're excited for the next video, and I hope to do this soon. Bye guys.